Oh, these flies gonna die today. Welcome back, Stupid Fast Nation. How are you guys doing today? We're gonna be taking a little bit of a break from the CBR 600 swapped ATC 600R trike swap that we're doing. I figured what would be a good interim video to do? I actually need another week to get that thing fully running and driving. I've got a couple parts on back order and I don't want to release another video until it's ready to ride. So I was like, what kind of video can I do in between then to be able to hold my viewers over? And I was like, well, we've been on the topic of yfz450s for a hot minute. Maybe I can give you guys some good, solid information on the best top 5 mods that I would do to a yfz450 if I was to buy one either brand new off the factory floor or even old 04 to 06 models or 07 to 13, whatever it is that your cup of tea is, this information is for you. Now, if you're like me and you really love your yfz450s, then you're gonna wanna pay attention to this because this information is really good for all years, makes of the yfz450. This may also apply to any other 4-stroke lovers. Guys, if you watch and you want to know how to upgrade your 4-stroke, this video is for you. A lot of these methods will also apply across the field with 4-stroke engines, but there are a few specific mods here that are super specific to just the yfz450 models. So with that being said, the very first thing I would do if I was getting a yfz450 straight from the factory floor is I would upgrade the exhaust. This will give you the biggest power gain up front. They can be a little on the pricier side, but you can get them anywhere from $300 to $1,000 depending on what name brand you want. Honestly, outside of the sound of the exhaust, you're pretty much gaining the same amount of power. There's not a big flow difference between all of the exhaust systems. Not enough that I would pay $700 more for a top name brand exhaust. That's my opinion. You're free to drop a comment below and tear me a new one. HMF, I happen to have this one lying around in the shop for this yfz450, so I just tossed it on. Great power gain, guys. It was a freebie for me from another parts bike. I want to give you guys a quick disclaimer. Any modifications you do, a 4-stroke engine is like an air pump. The quickest way that you can get the air into the engine and out of the engine is the best way to improve the horsepower gain. So the exhaust is opening up the outlet of the engine, allowing the air to get out more quickly. With that being said, you have to tune for any airflow changes in the motor. So anything we talk about in this video is going to improve the air in and out of the engine. Therefore, you need to increase or decrease the fuel depending on which way you're going with modifications, obviously. So that means for you early model carbureted guys, you are going to have to rejet the carburetor in order to get more fuel into the engine to mix in with that air and not make it lean so it detonates and blows up. I'm not responsible if your bike blows up. Definitely get it tuned by a professional. With that being said, the later YFZ guys, you have power commanders that will increase the amount of fuel being injected within the cylinder. So get your bike tuned. The very next thing I would do if I was going to upgrade the flow is when you're pushing more air out of the engine, you also need to be able to pull more air into the engine, right? So we talked about adding the fuel into the carburetor or fuel injection system and pushing it out the exhaust. But what about the air intake side? Well, it just so happens that one of my favorite upgrades is either taking off the airbox lid, which I do on almost every 4-wheeler and dirt bike and car I've ever worked on, and then replacing the stock air filter with an aftermarket high flow air filter assembly. ProFlow makes a good billet adapter and you can put K&N air filters, but when you do this, keep in mind you can suck in other debris around this airbox. So you do not want to destroy your engine with sand and other stuff going in there. Sometimes you want to get an outerwears cover to go over the air filter. So getting a high flow filter and a filter sock is a huge upgrade in air. And then also the intake can sometimes be a little restrictive. I would recommend replacing that tube as well. I don't think on the YFCs they're that restrictive, but sometimes on like the KFX 450s and other models, they're a little restrictive. They actually sell a big open assembly that goes through there. So I would definitely upgrade that. And also the same thing goes here. You still have to rejet on carbureted and you still have to get the fuel injection tuned for your fuel injected models. So moving on to number 3. So now that we talked about the exhaust, getting the air out of the motor, we talked about the air filter, getting the air into the motor, now we get to talk about the carburetor. And for you guys that are later models, you'll have fuel injected. So this may not exactly count for you, but if I had a carbureted model, one of the first things I look at is the accelerator pump. and we do this thing called the zip tie mod. And what happens is when you go to stab the throttle, there's actually a delay in the lever on the side of the carb for the accelerator pump. We put a zip tie in that, and so when you stab the throttle, the response, the actuation of that lever is instantaneous, therefore creating a stream of fuel going into the carb as soon as you stab the throttle. No delay, no bog down low. This baby just gets it and eats. That doesn't mean I'm leaving you fuel injected guys hanging. What you can do if you have a fuel injected model though, is you can actually buy an aftermarket unit called a power commander. This will change the amount of fuel going into your engine and the amount of fuel the injector is spraying in. Now, I still recommend a dyno tune. Power Commander is good for a couple modifications, but if you go knees deep in this thing, I highly recommend you take it somewhere to a professional and get it dyno tuned. That is how you get the best results. The optimum stoichiometric ratio of air to fuel for a naturally aspirated engine. That's the only way you're gonna get it, is by having it tuned. With that being said, we'll stick on this side of the quad. We'll move on to camshafts. Now, for you early model YFZ guys, you're lucky because Yamaha actually detuned the YFZ motor, so that way it didn't have as much power as the dirt bikes. So what you can do on the exhaust camshaft is you can actually run that back one tooth from the factory. Yes, that's right. Run the camshaft back one single tooth from the factory at the exhaust cam, and that will put you where the dirt bike is, and it will increase your horsepower a little bit and your throttle response. It's extremely noticeable, so be careful. And then also you have aftermarket camshafts like hotcam and webcam. Hotcams will run you somewhere in the $300 to $500 range, and then webcams will specifically grind an application for your build, but it's a little more on the pricey side, anywhere from $750 to $1,000 shipped to your door. So keep that in mind if you're looking to do something budget friendly. Those are your options. All right guys, so now that we covered the basics, let's hit some of the more in-depth stuff. You can do a lot more to gain power out of these things. Number 5 for me would be porting and bigger valves. If I wanted to spend a few extra bucks, that's where I would put it. If you don't know how to port, just do a quick Google search. There's plenty of guys out there willing to take your money and give you the most horsepower you can get. Upping the airflow of the cylinder head is one of the best gains in my opinion, because they can be restrictive. If you do a camshaft and you do an exhaust, you do an intake, you do all this stuff, porting, it will just complement it that much more, allowing the air to come into and out of the cylinder that much faster, and more volume of air being pulled into the cylinder and out of the cylinder. So I recommend porting. And then another step, if you want to go one step further, is you can actually have bigger valves installed. I think for YFZ450s, they sell a +1 millimeter kibble white, but if you're going to go this far, I highly recommend you stud the cylinder, because we start getting into so much cylinder pressure that these poor little YFZ450s, they're chugging along, they'll blow that head gasket right the hell out. So I highly recommend you stud these when you start doing a lot of modifications. Another cool trick that maybe a lot of you newer guys don't know is you could take a multi-layer steel head gasket. This is actually a trick I learned from an old timer, and you can actually go down to Advanced Auto, get an $8 can of Permatex copper spray, and then you can spray that head gasket twice on both sides. This will help create a perfect seal. Even if your head's just a touch uneven, this was a very old school trick, they would just copper spray it front and back, and you're good to go. So stud it, copper spray that gasket. Make sure you use a good name brand gasket. Don't use them cheap China $15 ones, because they don't hold up to power. So with that being said, if you guys stuck around this long, I appreciate you, and I brought you a bonus like I always do. So if you get through all those mods and you get really bored, I know some of y'all are thinking, well, what about the bore and the stroke of the engine? Well, yes, you can upgrade the bore and stroke. They got big bore, big stroker kits for these things. They just get super costly, and then the engine becomes very unreliable after that. So I don't always recommend jumping right into a big bore, big stroke. I recommend taking care of all the other mods first, and then a big bore, big stroke will only do better to complement the rest of those mods. But like I said, get ready, because you are not gonna have as much longevity out of the engine when you start increasing the bore and stroke. These YFZs come a little on the lean side of the tune from the factory to begin with. And so what happens is when you start increasing the bore, a lot of people don't jet them properly, and then they become lean and they blow up. So I highly suggest you get used to tuning first and go through the other modifications I listed before you hammer out a big bore and a stroker kit. There's also one other tip I want to give you guys. The early model YFZ450s, the 2004, 2005, and 2006 models, they had a bit of an oiling issue down here in the crankcase. It was fixed in 2007. So if you have an early model, it doesn't hurt to take these covers off and check to see if it was drilled and tapped for the jet. If you have the mod, you're good to go. If you don't, I highly recommend you get the mod done because you'll cook a crank easier than your mom can cook eggs for you. So highly recommend you take care of that. I think there's still a couple companies that make these jetting kits for these. So this stuff's still available and it's still out there for you. So guys, if you enjoyed this content, you like the free information, make sure you give me that like, share, subscribe, drop me a comment below, let me know what you want to see next, and stick around for the rest of the crazy ass builds I'm working on here in the shop. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.